Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Joining me is Senior Managing Editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access our complete newsletter and all of our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. Of the major Western religious traditions in the United States, only the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints retains the service until death policy for its top leader. Last week, Dallin H. Oaks, at age 93, became the 18th prophet president of the faith, succeeding Russell M. Nelson, who died September 27th at 101. Unlike a leader in any other American-based faith, Oaks will be expected to serve until the end of his life, as Nelson and 16 others did before him. Oaks' first counselor in the governing First Presidency, Henry B. Eyring, is 92. Todd Christofferson, the second counselor, is 80, one of four apostles in their 80s. Does this collective gerontocracy give rise to a stagnant, intractable, out-of-touch leadership? Would switching to a system that brings younger blood into the leadership invigorate the global faith of 17.5 million? Historian Gregory Prince, who has studied and written about these issues, joins us today virtually to discuss these, frankly, age-old questions. Greg, welcome.
Thanks, Peggy. It's nice to be back with you.
So when you wrote a piece on this topic for Dialogue, how did you measure the effects of aging on the church hierarchy?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background on that. We moved to Maryland 50 years ago and by fluke moved into the same LDS congregation as Lester Bush, having no idea he was there. We quickly became and remained lifelong friends until his death 2 years ago. That factors into this whole topic because Lester, who was a physician, spent his entire career working for the Central Intelligence Agency. He told me that early on, one of his assignments was to monitor the health and longevity of world leaders. And it was an easy shift for him to do that versus looking at the projected longevity of LDS leaders. I remember he showed me a graph that he generated almost 50 years ago, going out about 30 years thereafter for each member of the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency, showing what the probability would be that any one of them would become president during any given year. So this was an issue that he was thinking about 50 plus years ago. Now, when we decided to look at this topic seriously, the first question we had to ask was, how do you monitor fitness for a member of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency? There aren't any publications that give updates on that. So what we decided was that a good surrogate would be the ability to deliver in person a general conference address. The church published conference reports starting in 1897. So we used that as our starting point. And what we assumed and what was true was that in every conference, every member of the Q15, Quorum of the 12 plus First Presidency, would deliver at least one general conference address. For other general officers, that was not always the case, particularly when the first Quorum of 70 was reconstituted and you had dozens and dozens of men at that level. So we developed a database that ultimately had about 3,500 points in it. And what we did starting in 1897 was to take every member of the Q15 and each semi-annual conference give a plus or a minus. a plus indicating he was there. He spoke himself at the General Conference. In the earlier years before jet travel, some of the brethren would be out of town, out of the country, and couldn't get back for General Conference. So that didn't count for or against their record. What we found was that up until the 1960s, that rarely would a general authority miss more than one General Conference before he died. And not infrequently, they wouldn't miss any. So between 2 6-month periods, many of them, if not most of them, would go from health to death. That changed quite dramatically by the mid-1960s. And really that was most evident in the ministry of David O. McKay as church president, where he went for several years generally being present at the General Conference, but not able to deliver his talk. And you may remember that one or more of his sons would stand up in his stead and read the talk in place of his father. So that's when we started to see that medicine had made a difference, if I can simplify it, from the neck down, but not from the neck up. That men were living to an older age, but they weren't necessarily functioning intellectually in conjunction with longer life of their body. One way of envisioning this is to imagine a straight line, and on that, beginning at about age 85, is what I would call the zone of dementia, which means that by the time you reach that age, your probability of showing signs of dementia almost becomes 50-50, and that it keeps increasing the longer that you live. And so that's the dilemma that started to appear in the mid-1960s, and it has only changed in the sense that it's become more of an issue. Because if you look at average ages, and we'll talk a minute about some outliers, on average, the Q15 are older than their predecessors were, and that includes the church president. And they will live to an older age than their predecessors did by the time they died. So as an aggregate, more of them are moving into that zone than at any time in the past, simply because of the averages. Now, with two recent presidents, Gordon B. Hinckley and Russell Nelson, they were outliers in that they lived to extraordinarily old ages. I think President Hinckley was 97. Does that sound right? Mm-hmm. And then President Nelson, 101. And still were functioning really with their fastballs intellectually. I don't think that they had lost a stride there. Those were the outliers. We've had others who have undergone periods as long as 4 to 5 years where they were not able to function at all. And I think that's what we're talking about now, that what is the consequence for the church of what is a natural phenomenon that can be examined medically. But does that give you an adequate background as to how we did this? I pulled Lester out of retirement to do that article and dialogue. That was published 9 years ago. It was the last thing that he ever contributed to. But I think it's a significant piece, and I don't think that any of our observations have diminished since that time.
So, Greg, some leaders, frankly, have said having elderly authorities, like presidency, et cetera, brings on balance wisdom and extra benefits to the church. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's something to be said about that. I haven't tried to calculate the average. My recollection is that by the time a man becomes the church president, he's likely to have been in the Quorum of the 12 or the First Presidency for about 40 years. So that's a lot of experience. And certainly there are advantages to bringing that experience in. But it's like a balance. On one side of the balance is experience. On the other side is just capability to serve at a high functioning level. And where the one increases, the other decreases. And at what point does that scale tip? That's the essential question. And the answer is it's variable according to who the man is.
Yeah. And Greg, that's my next question. You've brought up what are the drawbacks of having these older leaders? They certainly have experience, but by the time they become a president, they're going to be much older. So what are the drawbacks of that?
We have seen that, David, 5 times, to my count, in the years during and since President McKay's presidency. So starting like the mid-60s, which is when he really went into visible decline, although he was still functioning fairly well intellectually. It would go in and out. I spoke with his personal physician who said there were times when he was quite lucid, even just a few months before he died. But nonetheless, the last 4 or 5 years of his presidency, he simply was not functioning at the level that he did before. He was succeeded by Joseph Fielding Smith, who I think was 93 when he became president.
He was the oldest, actually, by a few months, even older than Nelson. Yeah.
And by all accounts, he was not really functioning well even when he became president. And it was common knowledge that the man who was really running the church was his successor, who was Harold B. Lee, who had moved into the first presidency when President McKay died. So that's number 2. Number 3 was Spencer Kimball, who had multiple subdural hematomas. That's where you have bleeding outside the brain, and because of the pressure that blood accumulating there produces, it can give you damage to the brain and to intellectual function. President Kimball, by some accounts, was pretty much non-functional intellectually for maybe 3 to 4 years before he died. President Benson, probably 4 to 5 years. You remember well, you were near the epicenter of the unfortunate outburst from his grandson, who said that they're hiding my grandfather's capabilities, that he's really not functioning. And then the 5th was more recently with President Monson, that I talked to people who were working in the office of the First Presidency who said we could see signs of diminished intellectual function when he became president. And the deeper into his presidency he went, the less function there was there. And in that case, you could actually put numbers on it by looking at the number of times that he spoke in general conference sessions, that he conducted general conference sessions, and the length of his talks. And all of those diminished markedly over a period of about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, some were less than a minute, Yes. It's almost like an appearance at the mic is all. So even Greg, even if their bodies and their minds of these leaders remain intact and functioning, their attitudes may have developed at an earlier age. Does that create a disconnect between them and these younger generations of members?
Oh, I think that even if you're operating at full capacity, if you're in your 90s, it's very difficult for you to connect intimately with the thinking of a teenager. It's hard enough for parents to understand their own kids, but if you add 2 more generations to that, it becomes really quite difficult that you have an insular hierarchy to an extent that we didn't see when we were growing up. In other words, the approachability of these men has diminished. Part of that is just the inevitable consequence of this dangerous world in which we live. It used to be like when I was called to be a missionary in 1967, you could just walk in the church administration building. There was no sentry there. There were no metal detectors. That's all changed. And so there are layers of protection and insulation around these men, even when they travel. I spoke with one general authority and I said, you really don't have much touch with your reality out there. And he said, you're right. He said, from the time I go to the airport until I come home, I am with a handler, usually a stake president. And he said, unfortunately, he's going to want me to hear what he thinks I want to hear and see what he thinks I want to see. So it gets to your point, David, that there's not only the separation by age and the lessened ability to say what's going on in the minds of a teenager or a 20-something or a 30-something, but the fact that you're not in physical contact with them regularly makes that even more difficult.
Mormon Land will be right back.
So, and there's so much essentially reverence for the office of the prophet president. I mean, Russell Nelson, to many members, seemed to have almost superhuman powers. He was famously healthy when he became president and was pretty much healthy throughout much of his presidency. While that certainly was viewed as a blessing by members, could it also create a problem for the church? I'm just wondering if it creates an expectation among members that the next leader will be the same, have the same capability.
Well, that's why I said earlier that both President Hinckley and President Nelson were outliers, significant outliers, because in the case of the other five men that I mentioned, there were problems that developed. Now, they never rose to significance during the administration of Joseph Fielding Smith. And the reason was that you had a youthful, as in his early 70s, Harold B. Lee, who was really running the church. And there was no question about who the next leader would be and who was in control. Nobody would have stood up to Harold B. Lee. He was the senior apostle. That has not been the case with the other four. And that's why we had problems later on, that as their ability to function intellectually and even physically began to wane, the fact that the next in line was not in the first presidency generally became problematic. In fact, if you go back and look historically, if you don't count Joseph Smith, since it's a moot point with him, there was no first presidency before he became president. So we're talking 17 men after that. 10 of the 17 did not serve in a first presidency until they became president. And that raises some interesting questions. Why wouldn't the next in line be in that position automatically? But that's not been the case. And so if you have a first presidency where the president is ailing, but the next in line is not in the first presidency, then you have the potential for a power vacuum.
That's interesting because Nelson elevated Oakes, who was next in line, to the first presidency. But now we're back in the same situation, in essence, where we have Dallin Oakes, but the next in line is Jeffrey Holland, who's not all that healthy, 84 going on 85. He's not in that first presidency.
That's right.
Yeah. It's also interesting because Joseph Fielding Smith's presidency did not last long, which shows the longevity issue lengthening. I mean, Spencer W. Kimball, a dozen years, Tom Monson, a decade, those kinds of things can create that, right?
Yeah. The real problem, David, if you look at the specifics, was if you take those four ailing presidents, setting aside Joseph Fielding Smith, which we already talked about, McKay, Kimball, Benson, Monson, in each case, there was what I consider to have been a major crisis that arguably would not have occurred if you either had a fully competent president or if you had the next in line in the first presidency, so there was not the possibility of a power vacuum and a power grab. So with President McKay, what was that crisis? It was that towards the end of 1969, Hugh Brown made the assumption on the basis of a letter that Sterling McMurrin had written to McKay's sons that the policy banning ordination of black men could be changed administratively, and he tried to do it. That created a real clash of the titans, and it was the reason that Brown was released from the first presidency when McKay died. The first time that had happened since the death of Brigham Young. And it really was devastating to Brown. The next one was Spencer Kimball. When he was ailing in the early 1980s, two senior apostles, Ezra Taft Benson and Mark Peterson, and one junior apostle, Boyd Packer, set about to dismantle the history division of the historical department. And they were successful in doing that. That Leonard Arrington was released from his position as church historian. The other historians in that department were either sent to Provo or went other places. And that had a really chilling effect on the writing of church history that lasted for years and years. The second thing that happened shortly after that was that Mark Peterson decided that he wanted to discipline the historians whose work he didn't like. And there were a lot of them that fit that category. And so he unilaterally started to go after these men initially and called stake presidents and gave them instructions that they were to bring these men in and basically rough them up. None of them were excommunicated, but some of these interviews were rather brutal. Lester was one of the targets of that. Fortunately, we had a very savvy and unusual stake president, Bill Marriott, who used the opportunity to get to know Lester and said at the end of his meeting, gee, if you ever need help from me, let me know. But that was the outlier there. So that's with Kimball. With Benson, when he was out of function, you had the catastrophic episode of the September 6th, which had even a greater and longer lasting devastating effect on the writing of church history. And then finally, with President Monson, you had the infamous 2015 policy. All four of those arguably were catastrophic events.
The LGBTQ policy, for those who may not know what we're talking about, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. And let me just put a side note there. I've been on the board of governors of Wesley Theological Seminary in D.C. for 8 years now. Prior to my tenure there, I was still quite closely associated with the seminary. The week after that policy was announced, the president of the seminary called me and said, "Did you come down for lunch?" I did, and he said, "I thought I had a better handle on Mormon theology." And in fact, several years before that, he had traveled to Salt Lake and had met with the First Presidency and some of the apostles. So he had a pretty good idea of what was going on. He says, "What is it about your theology that condones the punishment of infants?" Because part of that policy was infants of gay couples cannot receive the sacrament, we call it blessing, others call it christening, that in effect is the acknowledgement of the religious community that they even exist. And I said, "David, I can't explain that one away." So yeah, that was devastating on many levels. And I heard reports, I think from credible sources, that over 60,000 people formally resigned their church membership in the year after that. And who knows how many more just walked away. We'll never know that number. So there you go, that you have these four instances where a prolonged period of dysfunction on the part of a sitting president resulted in really severe problems that just wouldn't have existed otherwise. And I think that's the issue we have to keep dealing with, because that's not going to go away. And in fact, if you just look at the medical aspects of this, it's going to occur more frequently.
I have often wondered those 5 years that Ezra Taft Benson was out of the public eye and not really functioning. If Howard Hunter, if somehow President Benson had gotten a medical leave or whatever, if Howard Hunter had gotten there sooner before he had all his physical problems, what an impact that might have had on the church.
Yes.
He was a very different guy, but by the time he became president, he was not in good health. It was the shortest tenure, but I just always kind of wondered what how the church could have been different. But here's my question. Latter-day Saint apostles seem remarkably healthy even as they age. Few in recent decades have succumbed to cancer or other diseases, nor have we had, car accidents, whatever. Is that from healthy lifestyles or genes?
It's a combination of the two. But, and here's where Lester's research really, I think, revealed some important findings. He said, number one, if you start the clock when the men are called into the quorum of the 12, not when they're born, he said, they already have outlived many of the odds. So if you start the clock then, they do not outlive their age peers. And he said, furthermore, they are not spared from the infirmities of age. Now, certainly the lifestyle, particularly the word of wisdom, is to the advantage, but it's the advantage of anybody in the church who follows those same rules. So if that's the cohort that you're measuring against, it doesn't give them any significant advantage to be in the quorum of the 12 versus not being in the quorum of the 12.
Greg, let's turn to a kind of foundational question. Many of our listeners will know the answer to this, but some may not. Is the practice of apostles serving for life a church doctrine, or is it just a precedent or a tradition?
Door number 2.
Okay, exactly.
If you look at the church history, when the Quorum of the 12 was established, 1835, seniority was based on age, which made sense because they all went in at the same time. Two of that group, the two most senior ones, were not in that group by the time Joseph Smith died. That was Thomas Marsh and David Patton. Marsh had been excommunicated. Patton died at the Battle of Crooked River. So the man who became Joseph Smith's successor, Brigham Young, was not only the senior apostle, he was the oldest apostle of that first cohort of 12 men. When they started to call new apostles, either because of excommunication or death, the question quickly became, is age still going to be the determination of seniority? And they quickly found out, no, we're not going to do it that way. Lyman White would have been the senior guy and next in line.
Would have succeeded Joseph Smith if you went by that.
Yeah.
Paul. Okay. All right.
So then they said, okay, it's going to be the longest serving apostle. And that held for John Taylor. It held for Wilford Woodruff. It held for, back up. It didn't hold for them because near the end of his death, Brigham Young, who had problems with Orson Pratt and with Orson Hyde, said, we're going to change this. Instead of starting the clock and letting it continue to run, if you were thrown out of the quorum, the clock starts again. Both Orson Pratt and Orson Hyde were excommunicated and then brought back in within weeks or months. And Brigham said, no, you got to get at the back of the line then. And that made a huge difference because the way it turned out, both of those men would have been church president unless that had been fixed.
That might have had implications for the priesthood policy, obviously,
That's
given
right.
Orson Pratt's. It's interesting from your piece, too, Greg, that even early church presidents were still questioning if this is the way it should work.
Well, and then what goes around comes around because near the turn of the century, Brigham Young Jr. was the senior apostle. And you wonder, is this payback time? You don't know, because I'm not aware of any records that document it, but the brethren decided, no, you're the longest tenured apostle, but you were called as an apostle before there was a vacancy in the quorum. And then when a subsequent vacancy opened up, you moved in. So we're going to start your clock when you went into the quorum, not when you were ordained apostle. And that's why Brigham Jr. did not become church president. So the way that we do it now didn't happen until more than 70 years after the church was founded. And it gets to your question, David, why do we do it the way that we do it now? And the best answer is because that's the way we do it now. But it doesn't mean that we're locked in, because you can't defend that there has been a single means of determining that. If you go back to Joseph Smith's death, there was a question, gee, are we even going to have another prophet? And that's largely why it took 3 years for them to decide, well, Brigham will be the president. It was group government prior to that time. Now, let me go back to an earlier topic that we talked about, and that was power vacuums, governance. There was an important transformation that took place shortly after David O. McKay died, and it was engineered by Harold B. Lee. He always was upset that the power went into the First Presidency and not the Quorum of the 12. Until the death of President McKay, we essentially had a monarchy, meaning that the president of the church was head of state and head of government. What President Lee did was to begin to shift things. Up until that time, no department reported to the 12. They all went directly to the First Presidency. So the Quorum of the 12 were staff. They weren't line. And that's what Lee corrected. So with a couple of exceptions, I think the Committee on Church Expenditures and maybe the Temple Committee, those have remained directly under the First Presidency. Everything else now reports to and is governed by the Quorum of the 12. So we moved to a constitutional monarchy with the president of the church remaining head of state, but the president of the Quorum of the 12 being prime minister. And in the case of Boyd Packer, he was prime minister for a long time and was very skilled at pulling the levers of power. That was part of the problem, because when you had a power vacuum in the First Presidency, he was not at all hesitant to run in and fill it. So that's part of what we're talking about here, that even though on paper you would think, well, gee, that's a corrective, that the church will go on and it will have governance. That's true, but you still have that power struggle, and perhaps even accentuated because now it's formalized that the president of the quorum is the prime minister, and he has a lot more power than any president of the quorum did prior to the death of President McKay.
So do you think, was Harold B. Lee the guy that it's become that all apostles are considered prophetseers and revelators? They're all sustained as that?
No.
Was that a Harold B. Lee thing?
I don't recall, Peggy.
I don't know when that happened, but it's definitely
that. Now, until President McKay, we didn't dwell on the prophet thing when we spoke of a church president. It was the president thing.
Yeah.
I've talked a lot with your cousin, Jim, and he says, my great-grandfather, President Grant, never thought of himself as prophet. He
That's
thought
true.
he was the administrative head of the church, but that shifted, and now it's mostly prophet. But I don't know when that transition to the Q15 regularly being denominated that way occurred. It's a good question.
Okay, so if somehow they changed or decided to not follow the whole succession tradition, how do you think that would work?
Back in the mid-'60s, President McKay called in the First Council of 70. This was before President Kimball reconstituted the First Quorum of 70. So at the general authority level, there were only 7 men. with that office. And he said, I want you, brethren, collectively to review the history of the Office of 70 at the general and local levels, make recommendations for the future of that office. But any recommendations that you make, you must be unanimous. And he said, we got our heads together. We came up with a very cogent plan, but he said on the issue of tenure, 5 of the 7 of us felt that we should have an emeritus status for the Office of 70. But the 2 holdouts said, we were called for life. And he said, we're trying to give you your life, but they wouldn't budge. And so it took 3 more presidents, meaning Kimball, before those guys, in his words, graduated. But he said we had the emeritus provision in place a decade before President Kimball accepted it. Now, what that meant was that from that point forward, the 70s would serve limited tenure. They didn't really announce age 70, but that's generally what it was. Although in some cases, President Hinckley asked some 70s to stay on beyond that age. Now I think it's pretty much across the board. You're 70, you're out. Release you with a vote of thanks, have a good life. And I think most of these brethren are probably very grateful when they go back to civilian life and say, this is not bad.
Yeah. Get to enjoy time with the grandkids or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
I asked him, I said, did you, as the first council, make any recommendations about the Quorum of the 12? He chuckled and he said, that was above our pay grade, but we had opened the door if they had chosen to walk through.
So, Greg, I'm thinking under the current succession model, it would seem the way to get a younger church president eventually would be to appoint younger apostles. But that doesn't always work now because of the way longevity has changed. Thomas Monson famously was 36 when he was an apostle. Everyone had him pegged as a church president eventually. He didn't become church president until he was 80. And I think a lot of people look at the current and they think David Bednar, he's in his 70s. He now, so if he becomes church president, he could be well into his 80s. So it seems the younger apostles aren't necessarily the answer. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because I remember when President Hinckley, it was either his interview with Mike Wallace or with Larry King. And the question was, how do you become church president? And he kind of chuckled. And he said, you outlive the 11 guys ahead of you. And that's 11 long life expectancies that you're looking at before you get there. So, yeah, David, if you choose them young, that's one problem. Another problem is that Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, all chose their young sons to be apostles at young ages. And every one of them died young, which I think gave rise to the saying, man proposes and the Lord disposes. I was talking to Ed Firmage about that. He was Hugh Brown's grandson. And he said, I have a lot of trouble trying to envision God as a divine hitman. So I don't think that selecting a young guy is the way to do it. I think that a logical way to do it is what they did with the 70s already. That you would say, okay, we will establish an age of emeritus status. Pick a number, maybe it's 75. So you're called into the quorum at age 75. If you're not in the president's seat, we release you with a vote of thanks. Caveat, I think there should also be a status of medical emeritus, so that if there is a physical or mental health issue that disallows normal function, that man should be granted medical emeritus status.
Now, would that be done of their choice, or would others make that for them? That could lead to all kinds of conspiracy questions.
I think what you would need is the LDS 25th Amendment.
Okay. Yeah.
To work that out in the councils and have a well-established policy that would go into all of those, much the same way if you're looking at professional sports teams. Who wins the division? Well, we have this and this and this. And if it gets down to all of those, we'll just toss it.
The tiebreaker issue. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
then you would say, all right, for the church president, you're obviously going to make that more than 75 years. Perhaps you make it 80. Choose whatever number you want. But again, have that caveat that there is medical emeritus status if needed.
Or voluntary exit maybe too, earlier?
Well, I think that could be, yes. Mm-hmm. And that goes to what I think we're getting up to, and that is, fine, you put all of this on paper. How are you going to make that happen? We don't have an initiative process where the church votes on it. And in fact, we have an ethos within the Q15 that any major decision requires unanimous vote.
Yeah.
How are you going to get 15 votes in favor of half the guys stepping down when they've been sitting there for 20, 30, 40 years awaiting the president's chair?
Mm-hmm.
It still can be done, but I think the way it would have to be done is something we don't talk about, but has happened, and that is the sitting president in full command of his faculties would get up in general conference and say, brothers and sisters, this is the will of the Lord.
Yeah.
And then say, next general conference, or whatever the timing is, I will step down. I will lead by example. And from that point forward, this is what we will do.
Seems like it would take a bold leader making a bold move, right?
Absolutely, it would. Now, has this type of thing ever happened? Yeah, it's happened. I understand that the announcement of a medical school at BYU caught the 12 by surprise. That may be the most recent example of it. There was a major one back in the 60s. President McKay was very fond of Polynesia and of the Polynesian saints. And he wanted not only to have the Church College of Hawaii, which was already there, but he felt that a cultural center that would preserve their cultures would be a very good thing. So he instructed Wendell Mendenhall, who was the chairman of the building committee, to make a presentation to the Quorum of the 12. He did so, and he came back afterwards and he said, President, they voted it down 12-0. President McKay said, Wendell, build it. I spoke later to Mike Grillicas. Mike had been a member of my ward in Westwood for decades, so I knew him well. And he said, I was asked by the church to develop the programming for the Cultural Center. Mike had been an executive with CBS. And he said, so I was in Hawaii and I got a call saying President Lee, or Elder Lee at that time, is coming back from an assignment in the South Pacific. He's going to speak at state conference in Hawaii. Will you pick him up at the airport? Sure. So I picked him up at the airport and we're driving onto the church property. You got the temple, you got the Church College of Hawaii, and you got a big construction zone. And Elder Lee looked at it and says, what's that? And Mike says, oh, well, that's the Polynesian Cultural Center. Well, he said, Elder Lee blew his stack not only in the car, but the next day at the state conference from the pulpit. Now, the happier ending to that is, Mike said, after Lee became church president, he said, we got a call from Art Haycock. Said, are you and Lorraine? He had married Lorraine Day, a fairly famous actress from the 40s and 50s. You and Lorraine going to be in Salt Lake anytime soon? Yeah, Lorraine's got a gig up there in a few weeks. Fine, President would like to see you, so drop by. So they went in, and he said it was Lorraine and me and Art Haycock and the president. And he said, the reason I called you in here is to apologize. Think about that for a church president.
Hmm.
He said, I was not in full command of the facts at the time, and I want to apologize for what I said, because by that time, the center had become the number one tourist attraction in the Hawaiian Islands. The point there being, however, that there was a major example where not only did the church president plow around the 12, he went against them. He went up against a 12-0 vote in the negative and did it anyway.
Hmm.
So it's the power of the presidency if the president wants to use that power.
So can you imagine any of the current leaders making such a bold change?
Yeah, but I'm not going to say which one.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Well, Dallin Oaks is the current president, but a judge by profession, very bound by precedent. Do you think Oaks could possibly do it?
I won't even speculate on that.
Okay.
That's an instant sentence to being in hot water.
Okay.
However, no, I just won't speculate on that.
All right.
So, a final question. What do you expect from an Oaks presidency?
I think that with 2 attorneys now in the first presidency, we will continue to see a very carefully thought out and plotted out course for the church, probably with a fair amount of legalese thrown in, which is what his oratorical style has been. Will there be any changes? I don't know. I can't predict. The McKay biography took me 10 years to research and write. During that same 10-year period, Ed Kimball was researching and writing the biography of his father. And we would occasionally call each other and just check notes. He said on one of those calls, he said, my father was the best follower in the church. He would never have thought to change anything. And then he woke up one day and he realized he was the president and he couldn't follow anymore. He had to leave. And he said that's when the church began to change. So you don't know. And it's the same thing that Art Haycock said to Mike Grillikas after that meeting. He said, Mike, I've been here for a long time and I've watched several presidents. And when they go from this chair to that chair, some of them change and you can't predict it. The changes that we have seen when that happens have been enormously important, particularly as you look at Spencer Kimball and what he accomplished that nobody, even himself, could have predicted. So we'll just have to wait and see. You don't know what the world is going to look like to that man. Even though it's just a few feet he's moving, that's a world of difference. My father, who was both a counselor and a bishopric and later a bishop, said, there's a world of difference between a bishop and a brick.
It's funny. Greg Prince, this has been fascinating. Thanks so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thanks for asking.
And thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up. And we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.